Hello, and welcome back to Restore Planet Podcasts with me, your host, Jack Cole. So today I'm joined by David Waters from the Great Bustard Group in Salisbury Plain. So David, welcome. Thank you for your time. Would you mind by starting by telling us a little bit about your background and the work that you've got going on?
Yeah, sure. So my name's David Waters. I'm the executive officer of the Great Bustard Group. And this was an organization I formed, 25 years ago. Um, Never really with the expectation of sort of managing, running the project full time. The idea was it was going to be a sort of a hobby interest type thing, and I would continue with my then main career as a police officer. Um, Everything took a rather unpredictable route. Now, reintroductions, translocations, restorations, whatever term you wish to use, are pretty mainstream activities for conservationists. But 25 years ago, they weren't. They were very unpopular indeed, very unfashionable. And the only bit that sort of spurred me on to spend more and more of my time till the point when Bustards took over my life was the fact that pretty much everybody just seemed to be determined to stop the project. And I could never really understand the reasons why. But it was just the default setting of almost every conservation or wildlife or bird watching type group in the UK. And times have changed enormously since the late 1990s.
And what sorts of arguments would people say? Because obviously, as you say there, it's very normal and even encouraged and very popular now to have all these reintroductions and with wilding and everything else. So what exactly was the motivation behind some of the pushback?
Well, there was certainly a philosophy that said, well, if something's gone extinct, it's because it can't cope with whatever the prevailing conditions are. So it's pointless to try and bring it back. Another one was, and perhaps the most common, was you should spend the money on the wildlife we already have. In bird sense, on corn buntings or lapwings or stone curlews, rather than spending money on an ambitious project. Of course, that argument was pretty well fatuous and irrelevant because the Great Bustard Group, up until now, really has been funded on money that it has raised itself. We haven't depleted wildlife grant bodies or government spending resources or anything like that in doing this project. We've raised it ourselves. And it's possible to raise money for something like the Great Bustard, the heaviest flying bird in the world, this huge, charismatic, magnificent looking thing with all its cultural heritage, which we've got in Wiltshire. It's on the county flag, it's on the coat of arms, it's the badge of everything from army cadets to girl guides. So we've got sponsors that could be local building companies and brewers and farmers and a volunteer base from all across. They'll come and help the Great Bustard. It's very well, it's not just naive, it's rather arrogant to think that all those companies that support us would go and support a corn bunting, which are super little birds, but they're small and brown and they don't capture the imagination in the way that the great bustards do. And the other argument, which still comes up, is from bird watchers who are sometimes really quite angry um, that their hobby of spotting and ticking off rare birds is somewhat confused now. And I remember one particular bird watcher very, very cross that there's been a project to restore cranes to the UK because he says when he sees a crane now, he doesn't know if it's a real one he can tick in his little book or whether it's just, in his words, a plastic one from someone who's just been doing crane farming. So yeah, I mean, none of those arguments make any sense to me, but those were sort of the most common ones that were thrown against the project.
All right. So would you mind telling us a little bit about exactly what is a bustard? Perhaps about its size, its life cycle, its habitat, its patterns, etc.
Well, there's a whole family of birds called bustards, depending a little bit on which source you go to, but about 25 different species. They're medium to large birds. They are across much of the world. There are no bustards in the North or South Pole, or in North or South America. But most other places have got one. There's an Australian bustard, an Arabian bustard, an Indian bustard, and so on. When I started to work on bustards, the I suppose call it conventional wisdom, the understanding was that the whole bustard family was the closest thing to them would be the cranes. They were reasonably closely related to the cranes, which, yeah, when you look at them, you can sort of imagine that. It makes sense. But genetics is always one of those areas that's getting more accessible, more affordable, and of course, more and more detailed. And the current opinion of people who study these things are that the bustard family fits somewhere between the cuckoos and the flycatchers in the bird's taxonomic tree, which seems utterly bizarre to me, but it's not for me to dispute that, but that's what they say. And of all the bustards, the Great Bustard is, I think, the most spectacular. There's a handful of real heavyweights. There, the Great Bustard, the Corey Bustard, which is the one from sort of East and South Africa, and probably the Great Indian Bustard. But of those, it's the Great Bustard, which is accepted as being the heaviest flying bird in the world. And the big males and the exceptional males, they can be up and be over 20 kilos in weight. So an absolutely immense bird.
Tell us a little bit about the history and persecution in the UK.
So great bustards disappeared in the UK in the middle of the 1800s. I think the last accurately recorded plundering of a nest was 1832, but they surely went on a bit more beyond that. The last birds in Wiltshire were killed in the 1870s. A lot of the documents produced in recent times will show the reason for the extinction was the Enclosures Acts. They say the Enclosures Act, but there was actually a whole series of Enclosures Acts where common land, sort of open, unfenced land for grazing animals and so on, was broken up into smaller fields. And certainly there are places in England, North Norfolk for one, where you can see the landscape was changed. But the reality is that Great Bustard was really close. It was on its way down and close to extinction long before most of these Enclosures Acts actually were implemented. And across the Wessex Downs, and in particular Salisbury Plain, there are huge chunks of land which never were enclosed. So whilst that might have been a reason in one place, it wasn't the universal reason for their extinction. And it's hard to get good quality data from things. You very often get a presence or absence. So it's very hard to get numerical data from things historically. But I mean, we do know in the Victorian era, if you were a geologist, you went round and collected rocks. And that's what they did. They were collectors. And if you were an ornithologist, you went round and you collected birds and their eggs. And certainly birds like great bustards, which are long-lived, but slow to mature and slow to breed with a low rate of natural recruitment, they just don't tolerate hunting. Once you start losing your adult females, your population will go into a decline. And of course, with the whole ethos of collecting, these Victorian bird collectors, the rarer a bird is, the more desirable it is in the collection. And perhaps the ultimate bird for any collector, well, that's the last one. If you could have the last one in your county or in the country, that would be a fantastic thing to have. So the final sort of wiping out of the species was down to the ornithologists of the time.
Wow. Okay, so you started your work in your group in 1998. Would you mind telling us how you started out? Obviously, you mentioned there was a lot of pushback, but then how things have developed through the years and where we are now and things you're involved with.
Well, the project really started with me commissioning a couple of pieces of study. So we employed an academic to do an initial sort of background study, a feasibility study. And we looked at everything from the history of the bird, the type of landscape that we have, where they still exist in the world, through to the abundance or otherwise of different crops and invertebrates and so on and so forth. there was then set up, and an awful lot of people involved in helping this, with a steering group which had government bodies, English Nature, as Natural England as they were in those days, and JNCC, DEFRA, the Department for the Environment from the government, and other NGOs. So we did have county ornithological groups and people like the RSPB all involved on this steering group, and it was to try and work down what would the key points be to try and establish success. But it took an awful long time, and I then commissioned a specific license application that ran to hundreds of pages, and that was submitted to the government minister. The Great Bustard was regarded as a bird not normally native to the UK. So on that basis, we needed a particular license to release them. And yeah, and it just sat there for just short of 2 years, with not getting a response back from the government at all. They wouldn't say yes, they wouldn't say no, they just wouldn't say anything at all. And a key part of all the preparation work was, where would we get some stock from? Where would the birds come from? The IUCN guidelines were quite clear that wild stock would be used in preference to anything captive bred. There was also a rather misunderstood but very, very widely held belief in the academic community that the Spanish great bustards, or at least the Iberian great bustards, would be unsuitable for use in the UK because that population could be genetically distinct, being somewhat or partially isolated by the Pyrenean mountains. Now, there was no evidence for this supposition. It was a question that was asked, really, in one paper, with a suggestion that they might be a bit different. And it was just one of these papers that then anybody publishing anything on great bustards for the next 25 years cited this paper, or miscited it, saying the Iberian great bustards are genetically distinct. But there was no evidence for this. But the UK government was very clear. They would not entertain the use of Iberian or Spanish great bustards, which is a big blow. Over half the world's great bustards occur in Iberia. The other populations to sort of consider with Germany, well, their population was very, very small at the time, having almost been pushed to the point of extinction. And there were some in Austria and Hungary, but again, relatively small populations and not really suited as a donor population. So had to go further. So the population we chose to work with was one in Saratov in southern Russia. And with a lot of help, we're able to set up an egg rescue program over there. Most of the agriculture and in the huge, huge fields they have there was actually done organically, which is normally very good for wildlife, but it does mean weeding is conducted mechanically, and that needs to be repeated. And in between these cultivations of the fields, with teams of tractors going across and cutting weeds and scratching the surfaces, the female bustards thought that made the perfect place to nest. And then, of course, a couple of weeks later, all the tractors would come back and the nests would be destroyed. And yeah, I mean, it did work. We were there for nearly 10 years. Russia's, I don't think, is a particularly easy place even for most Russians to live, and it was certainly quite challenging for an Englishman out there, again, particularly as an Englishman with a police background. But we did manage to get a reasonable hatch rate from the eggs. Half of the birds that we reared with our partner organization out there, we left in Russia. They're either released back into the wild or they went to zoological collections, Moscow Zoo in particular. But the other half I could bring back to the UK. Yeah, it sounds very quick when you say it like that, but the paperwork, and then in this end, the quarantine and everything that went with a red data book species being imported to the UK and having to do all our own quarantine was was pretty challenging. And a small population was established, and it did breed, but the numbers are very low. And certainly the biggest disappointment was the post-release survival. Once they got through their first winter, the survival rate was very, very good indeed. But there was a pretty high attrition rate in the first sort of couple of months after release. But it demonstrated bustards could live in southern England, and they could breed and they could rear chicks. And we then had something of a breakthrough with the University of Chester, who were in a position to support us with a genetic study. And again, with all the contacts I'd made through Europe, we were able to get blood samples from every European great bustard population. And for the first time in a genetic study, I was able to include the genetic material from the old English great bustards, the old indigenous birds that were killed across the UK and particularly in Wiltshire back in the 1800s. And various, say, museums and manor houses and things like that were happy for us to go and just take a tiny piece of skin, normally from the underside of the foot of these birds. All these were put into the pot, as it were, and compared. And lo and behold, the closest living match to the original English great bustards was Spain. And Russia, I mean, it's going to always have its logistical challenges, but it sort of opened up to the West for a little bit. And then as the years went by, one could sense that the politics was making it more and more difficult for us to work there. But armed with this information, the UK government then did allow the release of Iberian or Spanish great bustards. So went out, found the Spanish governments from two different regions, Castilla y Leon and Castilla y Mancha, incredibly supportive. I mean, they just sort of, yeah, what a wonderful idea. We'd love to help. And they actually issued licenses for us to go out to Spain, search for nests, and collect eggs directly. So it wasn't an egg rescue program like Russia, it was an egg collection. We had an early cut-off date to give the females plenty of time to lay a replacement clutch. So it was held we were having a minimal or even no negative effect on the donor population. The eggs were collected, put into a transport incubator, and with the help of Madrid Zoo and then either Birdworld or the Cotswold Wildlife Park in this country, incubation was completed. They all hatched in this country. As soon as they had hatched, we brought them down to our rearing station, and we were able to start the fairly complicated process of rearing great bustard chicks at our own site on the edge of an army training range in the middle of Wiltshire.
Fantastic. And so where are we today in terms of numbers?
So the total population is somewhere, we hope, not too far off 100 great bustards. We're not there yet, but somewhere approaching that. We also have a number of birds in captive breeding projects, which are hosted by 3 principal partners. To date, the captive breeding projects haven't been successful. They've managed to produce eggs, but the eggs have never been fertile. But we know great bustards are famously difficult to breed in captivity, but we will get there. But the main emphasis and story is the wild living great bustards. We're just on the cusp of actually been able to start a much improved monitoring program, and we got additional staff and resources to do this. But we think around half our birds are released birds from either Russia or Spain, and the last releases of birds brought into the country from Spain was 2019, and the other half are wild parent reared English Wiltshire great bustards. And of course, and those are the ones that we really do value. That's what the whole project is about, this second, third generation of wild great bustards that we've got. And we do, believe that the population is self-sustaining and slowly growing under its own efforts.
And looking to the future, would you tell us about the Great Bustard Group vision for over the next, I think it's 10 years?
Yeah, of course. So looking forward for the next 10 years and beyond, the number one objective is to take this population across southern Wiltshire. It's spread out. We've got three three core areas or three sort of subpopulations, and we really want that to continue to grow and get to at least double its existing size. Excuse me. Beyond that, yes, there are other areas in England, and it is very much England rather than the UK with the great bustard, habitat-wise, that I think could sustain great bustards. They're a bird that likes big open country areas, big sky country. They don't like hedges and small fields and so on. But an important fact is you don't need to control the whole landscape. As long as they've got somewhere to feed in the winter, and an absolute favourite of great bustards would be oilseed rape. There's a bit of a myth that they're grassland birds, and they're not. They're really an arable farmland bird. And somewhere for them to breed safely. And that could be specially prepared plots like the stone curlew plots and things like that. Yeah, with minor tweaks, I think there are several areas, especially ones that used to hold great bustards, so Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and parts of East Anglia around Cambridge and that area. Great bustards could do well. For the short, medium term, we don't have any sort of additional stock. Obviously, the current situation with Russia, no one's going to get any support for getting birds out from there. The Spanish have been tremendous, but actually since we've been working there, an awful lot of the good bustard areas have gone under really intensive production of nuts, almonds particularly, and pistachio, and these new super intensive olive groves. So Spain's got its challenges there. So although they were very, very helpful to us, I'd be doubtful about getting further birds from there. Captive breeding remains an option for other release sites. But of course, if we can grow our population down here in Wiltshire, in the fullness of time, that could well be a donor population for elsewhere. But not within the next 10 years, I'd suggest. We're looking at increasing and building our population here. We've got conservation measures planned. We've really got to protect the females from the spring mowing of silage, and to just try and raise further funds and further improve the habitat that we've got here to increase number of nests and the survival of the chicks, and ultimately the recruitment into the adult population.
Finally, David, where can people find your work to support or donate if they wish?
Yeah, so, well, the easiest way to contact us is through our website, which is greatbustard.org. There's all sorts of ways to, engage with us. Either just hitting the contact buttons. There is a conveniently placed donation button. We are an organisation that absolutely relies on individuals making donations. We're a membership organisation. We also encourage people to come and visit the project. It's a bit of a sort of a three-way management issue with us. We want to keep the birds very happy. Of course, we don't want the great bustards disturbed, but we're also on a working farm, but we're also on an army range. So it's the bustards, the farmers, and the army. We've got to keep them all happy. We do. The army are tremendous in helping us with that. But if people come with us, we know it's all going to work, and that works very well to help us keep the project funded. But all the details of that is at greatbustard.org.
David, thank you for your time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.